When we talk about the alt-right and various fascist groups on this channel, what mainly plays into all their ideology is a revisionist view of history, which involves glorifying certain groups, but it is a mythicized version of that group. And I guess there's no more group that has been mythicized in Western politics in general than the ancient Spartans of Sparta. Now, of course, when I describe to you what kind of society Sparta was, and many of you will know from popular fiction, it lends itself quite well to general fascist in modern times, in the 1930s, historically, but it also lends itself to general myths about Western culture and Western society that is kind of widespread across the centre and the right, not just the far right. So we're going to get into all those different things today. So what I wanted to talk about is why the Nazis in Nazi Germany liked the Spartans, mainly for eugenics, but also because of their militaristic culture. Talk about why the modern alt-right liked them, how their myth got spread, and how 300 the film is part of spreading this myth. And really just discuss, like I said at the start, how the Spartans gained prominence and were held up as this elite fighting force, this elite city-state, despite the fact, they'd been defeated numerous times. And talk about the Battle of Thermopylae, which is in 300, and how it's been given way more importance than it has any right to historically. Now, some of you get annoyed by this, but I'm about to plug my Patreon and social medias for about a minute, so please skip forward if you don't care about that stuff. Before we get any further, a lot of my work on this channel is demonetized because when you're covering more serious, sometimes edgier topics, YouTube doesn't like this. So if you've ever enjoyed my work, please consider becoming a patron. And you don't have to pledge a crazy amount. I want to build up my Patreon based on as many people as possible, pledging little amounts like $1 or $2. So if you feel like I have ever brought anything that's worthwhile into your life and my content, please really consider becoming a patron to help me continue to do this regardless of if YouTube monetize or not most of my videos in a given month. Also, if you want to join our communities, come check out our Discord and my subreddit. Those links in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, please check out the Kavernacle at Twitter, at Instagram, and also my personal Reddit where you can keep up to date with all my content and what I'm doing. Thanks so much for the recent growth. We're on 34k subscribers. Hopefully get to 35k in June. For every 5k we get a new chocolate orange. I'll be back to streaming tomorrow. All the streams go up on the Kavernacle Extra, my second channel. So if you want to watch any of that stuff, go check that out. And I hope everyone appreciates this is my second upload in a row. It is so hot in the UK and I'm on the 3rd floor of a building and I'm roasting right now because I have to, close all my windows. So I hope you guys appreciate how much I'm suffering to bring you this content. And if you care more about the Zack Snyder 300 side of these things, please check out my video from last Wednesday where I talked about why Zack Snyder had a pretty reactionary fan base. Now, with the fascists of the 1930s, what they wanted to create were these militarized ethno-states, where certain races and genders had these fixed roles in society. So the Nazis, for example, where it was the duty of every German in the greater German empire, which they'd established and taken over territories with German peoples, would serve in the military for the greater good of the Nazi state. Women had their role, which was to not be involved in military affairs. They were seen as these mothers, and that was an important role, but they weren't seen as equal to the men. And of course, through things like the Hitler Youth, they were training very young men into this ideology and into military tactics to ensure that the next generation of German soldiers would be just as good as the current generation. Now, you can already see how this has, striking similarities to Sparta already. And of course, they also felt that various segments of the population would be damaging to the Nazi state That included various people with physical and mental disabilities. This could be genetic disorders, this could be injuries, this could be anything. And they saw these people as, I guess, parasites, people who only hurt the state because you had to provide for them and they couldn't give back to this state. So with that stuff in mind, with the Nazis specifically, let's discuss why the Nazis and Hitler himself liked ancient Sparta. So let's talk about Spartan society for a second and how the boys were trained. So National Geographic wrote a good article. So boys to men, from birth, Spartan boys were prepared both physically and mentally for their later inevitable combat service. Most boys lived with their families until age 7, after which time they were delivered to the agoge, part military academy, part boot camp, to be trained as soldiers, family ties loosened, and young recruits effectively belonged to the state. The 1st century Roman historian Plutarch details the regime to which the young Spartans were subjected. Their training was calculated to make them obey commands well, endure hardships, and conquer in battle. When they were 12 years old, they no longer had tunics to wear, received 1 cloak a year, had hard flesh, and knew little of baths. They slept together on pallet beds, which they collected for themselves, breaking off with their hands. No knives allowed. The tops of the rushes which grew along the Eurotas. When war loomed, the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, decided when to draw from a silo of young fighters. Their proposal then had to be approved by the Spartan Assembly. Spartan men aged between 20 and 60 would be then called up, starting with the most experienced, and 300 of the best hoplites in Sparta would become the king's private guard. That's where you get 300 title from. Now let's talk about the eugenics in Spartan society. So other ancient civilizations such as Rome, Athens and Sparta practiced infanticide through exposure and execution as a form of phenotypic selection. In Sparta, newborns were inspected by the city's elders, who decided the fate of the infant. If the child was deemed incapable of living, it was usually exposed. In the Apophita near the Taygetus mountain, trials for the babies included bathing them in wine and exposing them to the elements. To Sparta, this would ensure only the strongest survived. Adolf Hitler considered Sparta to be the first Volkisch state, and much like Ernst Haeckel before him praised Sparta for its selective policy. Hitler said, "The Spartans were once capable of such a wise measure," talking about the eugenics, "the subjugation of 350,000 helots by 6,000 Spartans was only possible because of the racial superiority of Spartans." And the helots were other Greeks that were enslaved by the Spartans and basically propped up Spartan society, doing all the jobs the Spartans didn't want to do. They worked in the fields, they worked as, just general slave labor, they worked in the military as well, and a ritual at the time was actually teaching young Spartans to kill these guys to keep them in line, and they were often treated extremely poorly by the Spartans. But to people like Hitler, this just showed, the Spartans had created this super race of humans, and the Germans should aim to copy that. And in Germany, for example, 400,000 Germans were sterilized between 1939 and 1945. Hitler had actually considered killing most children in Germany to try and create this race like the Spartans. So going into the Nazis a bit more, a Hebrew historian called Oren Hubert wrote a book about this stuff, and I just want to read an extract from that. So the Nazis continued a concept found in Prussian militaristic ideology, in which Sparta became the ideal model for the training of youth and national achievement. Helen Roche opens her article by stating that Goebbels visited Sparta in 1936 and he felt it was a true German city. Alongside Goebbels was the Minister of Agriculture, Richard Walter Dare, who also idealised Sparta to the point where he stated a number of times, as well as published a few articles that put Sparta as a German ideal of blood and soil. In January 1942, Hitler is recorded to have said in his monologue, "If anyone asks us about our forefathers, we must continually imply they were Greeks." Hitler started his use of Sparta as his ideal as far back as 1928 in his secret book, and continued to imply the importance of Sparta as the German ancestor, thereby giving the German propaganda machine full legitimacy to use and abuse Sparta throughout the course of the war. From the pre-World War I Germany through Nazi Germany, the German public was slowly exposed to a growing national Spartan ideal that would be fully tethered to the Nazi ideology to an extent that it would become German history. German ancestry and Nazi ideology to be used as part of the overall Nazi propaganda machine. It was inevitable that Nazi Germany would take up Spartan legend as their own ideology, since it was already being ingrained into their subconscious ever since the early 19th century, all fitted in with Hitler's ideologies, as well as his leading supporters such as Goebbels and Himmler, and were adopted and amplified by the German Nazi war machine to instill further and blind obedience in its military arm, as well as act as a new world religion. Now, if anything shows you how full of shit the Nazis actually were, is that they, at the same time, claim ancient Sparta as their ancestors. And it mentioned Himmler there, Himmler, who constantly talked about the pagan Germans of ancient times and how the Germans were all descended from these people who existed in this magical time. And essentially, the German people who'd always existed in that territory were super beings who were pure humans. They weren't like the other races who were mixes with like gnomes and dwarves. They actually believe this stuff. It's pretty crazy. They were this pure race, and the heroes who had, fought off the Romans and stuff were all idealized. While at the same time, they're trying to say they're also descended from the ancient Spartans miles away in the Aegean Sea. So with everything to do with fascists, it's normally insane revisionist history, but also history that doesn't even make sense. Hitler essentially claimed this as German ancestry because he seriously idealized the Spartan society and wanted to use it as a model for Nazi Germany. Now, I also made a video about Golden Dawn a couple months back. Can't believe I didn't really mention this stuff. I mainly focused on, I guess, more contemporary Greek nationalism, because although Golden Dawn started as a pagan movement that did idealize the Spartans and the Athenians and other groups and, Greek gods, they quickly put that away because they thought it'd be easier to ally themselves with Orthodox nationalists, who of course wouldn't accept them being pagans. But still, every year Golden Dawn would go to the site of the Battle of Thermopylae, do various chants, and to them it symbolized this great battle between the West and the East. And that is something that has also been brought into popular culture and something the Nazis love, and that is the Battle of Thermopylae. So Golden Dawn love this stuff to them because it represents something xenophobic, because Golden Dawn actually started as just this group that would go beat up Afghan and Pakistani refugees. So to them, this Battle of Thermopylae represents the Greeks fighting off the non-white Persians, essentially, even though the Persians also, believe they were Aryans. And we've talked about Iranian Nazis as well, who believe they are the superior race with the Germans because they are the original Aryans in their view. Gets very complicated when you're talking about so many fascist groups. But yeah, you can see how the Battle of Thermopylae really plays well with modern xenophobia. And to many groups, not just far-right groups, what it represents is sort of like the Western Alamo. So lots of people in history thought that this Battle of Thermopylae was the Spartans saving the Greek world, and I guess by association, saving the modern Western world from the evil, backwards Persian Empire that would have just destroyed anything good that the Greeks had achieved. But I don't need to tell you that Sparta actually allied themselves with the Persians when they were fighting the Athenians a couple decades later, and that Persia was not some backwards empire or anything, and that, many Greeks actually switched sides and fought for the Persians, and the Persians had Greek troops as well. History is far more multicultural than fascists would have you believe, and it's not as black and white as here were the Greeks, here were the Persians, this side was good, this side was backwards. That is just way too simple, and most of the time viewing history like that is completely wrong. So there was a good article in the Soapbox called "The Sparta Fetish is a Cultural Cancer." It's very good, really, really in-depth, and I don't want to read most of it. I decided for this video I'm not going to spend most of it reading articles, but I do want to read something that they talk about, and it's how this myth came to be. Why do modern alt-right groups like it? Why do the Nazis love it? Why do people going back in history love the Spartans and love the Battle of Thermopylae? And we're going to get into this through the article. So a lot of the blame for our myth addiction can be laid at the feet of the Spartans themselves, whose mystique is embedded in their relative silence among ancient Greek nations. The Spartans of Laconia left us virtually no writing on how they saw themselves or the world. Thucydides describes their defining attributes as secretiveness, and they were famous for their distrust of outsiders. They even purportedly had a policy of not engaging the same enemy in battle repeatedly, out of fear that their foes might learn how they fought. We are entirely reliant on second and third hand accounts of who the Spartans were. The fetishization of the exotic impacts every outsider's perspective, and contemporary writers from Herodotus to Xenophon to Aristotle all had a breathless, almost fanboyish fascination with Sparta. A French historian, Francois Ollier, described this phenomenon as le mirage spartiate, the Spartan mirage, the wavering haze of uncertainty that cloaks any attempt to understand a people who above all wanted to be mysterious. Historian Tom Holland has theorized that the Thermopylae myth was deliberately cultivated by the Athenian general and master spin doctor Themistocles in an attempt to shore up Greek morale and stave off surrender as the flames of Athens-occupied Acropolis lit the night sky. But this fetishization marched on throughout Western arts and letters, and always on the same theme, praising the Spartans' legendarily selflessness, restraint and devotion to duty. The 3rd century Egyptian Christian apologist Origen Admantius compared Leonidas' self-sacrifice at Thermopylae to Christ's passion. Cynthius of Cyrene, a 5th century Christian bishop, proudly and falsely traced his lineage to the Spartan royal houses. In the Renaissance, even Machiavelli got in on the act, praising Sparta in his discourses on Livy. That republic indeed may be called happy, whose lot has been to have a founder so prudent as to provide for its laws, under which it can continue to live securely without a need to amend them, as we find Sparta preserving hers for 800 years without deterioration and without any dangerous disturbance. Sparta achieved nothing of the sort, but in Machiavelli's messaging of anecdotes, the ends justified the means. John Alma, the Bishop of London, just after Machiavelli's time, called Sparta the noblest and best city governed that ever was. Just a small side note, I kind of find it funny that Thucydides and Machiavelli are key figures in spreading the myth of Sparta, in that these two writers are actually central to, I guess, international relations political theory developing. And Thucydides' work on the Sparta and Athenian conflict and Machiavelli's The Prince form the basis of the realist school of thought of international relations. Just thought that was a interesting side note. But there you see how throughout history, whether it was a couple hundred years after Sparta became irrelevant or over 1,000 years, that these figures constantly looked at Sparta being something that was good. And it's extremely ironic that, bishops and Machiavelli and all these people seem to view this militaristic slave state as, a real, I guess, beacon of humanity and what we should all aspire to create as a nation. But that just shows the power of the revisionist history that created this myth in the first place, that even people who lived a lot closer to the time of the Spartans and lived in a geographical position that was closer as well, still believed all these things that feels like were invented with 300. Now, like I said, 300 is the modern extension of the Spartan myth, a wildly successful film. Loads of people love this film, and the film has its merits in that it has cool action scenes, but like I said in my last video, is extremely problematic for the orientalist depictions, especially the Persians. Now, the Soapbox has a little comment on 300 and said, 300's plot is at odds with reality. Ephialtes was neither a Spartan nor a hunchback and may not have even existed. The 300 Spartans stood at the head of a force of approximately 7,000 other Greeks, not to mention their own helot slaves, who fought as light infantry, and the sum total of his brave last stand wasn't Greek glory, but a paltry 3-day delay for Xerxes' army before he went on to put Athens to the torch. Now, you can't find many historically accurate interpretations or representations of Sparta in the present day in many forms of media, but I would say give Assassin's Creed Odyssey a chance. It actually has a mode where it just shows you the history of this, place.
The end. The Greeks decided on Thermopylae. The area featured a narrow pass that could act as a bottleneck for the Persian army, negating their numerical superiority.
Yes, one of the main reasons Xerxes invaded Greece was to get revenge for Darius's defeat at the Battle of Marathon.
And actually, the intro actually shows your relative, your brother or sister, depending on who you choose, get thrown off this mountain like many Spartan children did. You actually go back to Sparta and see these children being treated very badly, and you can intervene or you can not intervene because you're of Spartan heritage.
Those children will be ripped to shreds. We should help them.
Alexios, wait. You shouldn't interfere. This is Spartan training territory.
I can't stand here doing nothing. I'm going to help.
Although you're a mercenary who fights for both sides. So I feel overall it's a pretty good window into what Spartan society was kind of like without this super nationalist, revisionist history, I guess, veneer over it. So I'd totally recommend, if you love this stuff and you want to be interested in it and consume a form of media that doesn't feel like grossly racist as something like 300, then I would check out Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Of course, not historically accurate, you know, considering what the Assassin's Creed universe is when you actually get into who these characters are and stuff. But again, pretty enjoyable and has its own little history mode if you're actually just interested in that stuff. But getting to 300, it really is just an extension of the revisionist history that you have heard about throughout this video, and that numerous historians, philosophers, and politicians throughout the 2,100 years since Sparta was relevant have constantly peddled. So 300's problems, and I outlined that in the last video, is orientalism, and it was also made during a time of increasing hostility between the Western world and the East or the Islamic world. So this film was released during the Iraq War. It was during the war in Afghanistan, also during increasing tensions with Iran. So when you have this war in this film where the Spartans are all played by white Westerners, mainly from Britain and America, and then you have the Persians all depicted as either faceless, like the immortals are, and behind their mask is this like horrible creature, or they're depicted in a way that buys into like every orientalist trope from like the Victorian times. You have like Xerxes with all these piercings. You have this very sexualized view of the Iranians in his camp. Very, very old school historic orientalist tropes, like literally stuff they would write in the Victorian times about what India, Iran, Egypt was like. So very problematic. And then it has one side as the heroes, and it even glorifies Spartans' own like fascism, which is very problematic with the film. And that's why it's so problematic this film has become so popular, because it is given mass appeal to basically a story of fascism, and the film itself doesn't try to downplay the fascism. And Frank Miller has acknowledged that his own work and Spartan society was pretty fascist, but his argument essentially is it can sometimes be a good thing, because it's clear what his view of the Persians were. And like I said, no nuance is given. You could make arguments about Persian society being more progressive than Spartan society, of course. And you could also talk about the nuance where Greeks would ally themselves with the Persians, like the Spartans did, where Greeks would actually go work for the Persians and travel to Persia, and how history, like I said, is a lot more interconnected and diverse than you would believe. But one point I wanted to address in the last video, people said 300 isn't glorifying this fascist society. 300 is actually a satire of fascism, like Starship Troopers or something, because this story of the Battle of Thermopylae is actually told by a Spartan sent home from the battle to tell their story. Now, I don't really buy that, because you can say maybe it's a play on like propaganda. Maybe you could say that. But that doesn't really detract from the problems in the film, because when you watch the film, it's pretty clear how it makes you feel as a general audience goer. Who are the good guys in the context of this film? The Spartans are the good guys. Who are the bad guys? The Persians. And this is problematic because not only is this released during a time of increasing conflict in the region between Iran itself, it also whitewashes the Greeks, so they all are just white Western people from the British Isles and from America, but it also makes the Persians far more dark as well. And I just feel the subject matter is not treated with enough nuance or sensitivity to have this satirical message, or making a broader point about, American propaganda or propaganda during the war on terror, because I feel like that wasn't the point of the film. And I feel like it's very, very hard to read it that way. And it's a very charitable interpretation, which allows you to excuse the xenophobia, the orientalism in the film. And even if that was the point, the film has been taken a certain way by fascist groups throughout the world and conservative groups throughout the world who think this is like the Western Alamo. This is where Western civilization prevailed over the backwards East. And if this film was designed to be a satire or a satire of propaganda, I feel like not as many people would take it like this. Overall, yeah, I feel like it's just an extension, a glorification, a whitewashing of the Spartan myth that was told by various people like Herodotus, by Thucydides, was also believed by people like Machiavelli. I don't think it's changed too much, apart from it's become an even more consumable medium in a real stylized movie that has cool fight scenes and has mass appeal and has really brought mythicized Spartan culture and Spartan history into the mainstream. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. If you want to follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and on Instagram, come join our communities on Discord and my subreddit. If you want to support my work, check out my Patreon. And if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.